Hello friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CEC-UGC lecture. Friends, today we will be continuing our ongoing lecture series on political thoughts, and the topic for today's lecture will be political thought of Machiavelli. And to take this lecture, we have our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha with us. He is Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. He has been teaching since last 25 years, and he has expertise in Indian politics and political thoughts. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Jha to our studio and request him to begin his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Asmita. Today's lecture we are going to devote on the political thought of Machiavelli, one of the eminent Western political thinkers of modern time, with whom many scholars believe that modern thinking started in the West. Apart from heralding this, era of modernity or epoch of modernity, Machiavelli is also credited with the view that he introduced many new things in political thinking of the time, and also initiated many new features in the method through which politics is understood and analyzed. So, therefore, Machiavelli's position is quite significant so far as Western political thought is concerned. But at the same time, we should also remember that Machiavelli is one of those thinkers who is mostly defamed, he is criticized, he is condemned for many things which he basically propounded or he espoused through his writings. Particularly the way he looked at politics, the way he separated ethics from politics, the kind of discourse which is available in Machiavelli so far as the statecraft is concerned, his realism and many other issues. Basically, he is subjected to rigorous criticism. But nonetheless, one thing is important, that one has to analyze Machiavelli's political thought in the context of his time, in the context in which he was writing, and the situation which was basically obtaining at that point of time in Italy, where he was located. Because that is perhaps the way one should also interpret and analyze the political thought of any person, any thinker, and Machiavelli is no exception, because everyone is conditioned by his or her social conditions, particularly the thought process, and therefore, the sociology of knowledge becomes important. And whatever Machiavelli writes in his two important books, which are basically available to us for scrutinizing his political ideas, one is Prince, other is Discourse. In both writings, what we find that Machiavelli is trying to reflect on the conditions obtaining in his time in Italy. So, therefore, his contextual thought process or the analysis of his ideas or interpretation of his thought in the context of Italy of that period, that is the 15th century, 16th century, is quite significant. Now, so far as the time period of Machiavelli is concerned, it was between 1469 to 1572, and therefore 1527, and therefore this is the time which is very crucial from the point of view of Western political thought and Western history. Many of us would recall that this was the time when West was undergoing major qualitative changes in social, economic and political life. But this is the time when old order, old economic order, social order, they were basically cracking and collapsing, and the new order was yet to arise. And it was in this period of transition that Machiavelli arrives on the scene, and he basically writes, and some of his ideas were so important that in fact he imagined the time which was yet to come In fact, he imagined and visualized a period or the changes or the structure in society which came much later. And therefore, what we find that in Machiavelli, with Machiavelli, you find a new tradition in political thinking emerging in the West. And therefore, not surprising that Machiavelli is also known as one of the architect of modern political thinking. Some of the features of modernity, in fact, are associated with his political thought. For example, secularization, the entire process of secularization of political ideas or secularization or a secular political thinking we find in Machiavelli. In fact, there is no reference of, or even if the reference comes, it is not quite a reverential reference of papacy, the Pope and the religion in Machiavelli's political thought. In fact, Machiavelli's political thought is also remembered for the kind of realism which he demonstrated in terms of his advice or counsel which he gave to the ruler, and that happened to be the prince. Of course, it is also to be remembered that monarchy was his only second best government. In fact, he believed that the republic could be the ideal form of government for the people. But of course, with a rider that if people are virtuous, then republic would be perhaps the ideal form of government. But if the people are not virtuous, they are vicious, then perhaps he believed that only under monarchy they can survive and they can govern themselves. So therefore, in fact, there are a number of issues which we find that Machiavelli is talking about, particularly from the point of view of statecraft, from the point of view of administration, from the point of view of government, from the point of view of the society and the people. And those ideas are even significant today. So therefore, from time to time, we remember Machiavelli, we study him, we interpret his political thought and try to make sense of it, that how those ideas are still useful and relevant so far as the governance and administration are concerned. But one thing is very significant to remember, that Machiavelli is often referred as a Renaissance thinker, a thinker who basically was reflecting, or a thinker who was the product of a Renaissance intellectual and political climate. Now, what was this all about? How and why he is considered as a Renaissance thinker? So therefore, it becomes important that before we look at some of the important features of Machiavelli's political thought, we also have to take into account the Renaissance and entire context which was shaped by the Renaissance political Renaissance ideas. Now, Renaissance to some extent is also can be understood as the rebirth, the rebirth of what and why rebirth. For example, there are two important developments in the West at that time. One was Renaissance, another was Reformation. Interestingly, both were separated by practically 100 years. And therefore, Renaissance and Reformation, these are the two markers of modern period in the West, something which not only influenced the social and political life of the people in the West, but also had far-reaching consequences for the entire world. So therefore, in fact, it is important to understand this process which is called Renaissance. Of course, Renaissance emerged in Italy sometimes in 14th century, and then gradually traveled to France, traveled to England, traveled to Germany and many other parts of the Europe. And Renaissance, when it's called rebirth, then it was basically a reawakening. Basically, this was the reawakening of the ideas, a reawakening of the entire thinking which had practically slept during the medieval period. So sleeping West suddenly woke up, and this awakening was in terms of remembering the old glories, the old past, that was the Greek and the Roman past. So therefore, in Renaissance period, what was happening, that suddenly the society, the people, they started remembering their glorious past, that was the Athens, the ancient Athens, ancient Rome, and so on and so forth. that why that period or that society was so glorious, why the history was so glorious. And one thing, as we often discuss in political thought, as we have discussed earlier in context of Plato's and Aristotle's political thought, that how they reflected, imagined and analyzed and explained social, natural, political phenomenon with the help of reason. And so, what happened in the medieval period, the reason became the biggest casualty, and instead of reason, what was adored at that time was faith. So, faith replaced reason, and God, or basically what is normally known as the representative of God, that is basically church and the Pope, they replaced the humanity and the human beings. So, basically what happened, that in medieval period, which is also referred as a dark age, because there was darkness all around, no light, no reason, no vision, and it was in this period of the dominance of papacy, church and the feudal lords, what happened, that West had basically entered into this dark age. So, in modern times, what happened, that when people were trying to come out of this medievalism, this dark phase, the dark age, the era or the age of faith, and basically they were moving again in the domain of reason, then what happened, that suddenly a new awakening came and they started remembering, recalling, reimagining the future as they had done earlier during the ancient Athens and ancient Rome. So, this is something what is normally referred as Renaissance. And this in Renaissance, this period of Renaissance, a lot of new churning started, and this started in area of science, this started in area of literature, this started in area of philosophy, this started in area of art, culture, painting, architecture, so on and so forth. So, in every area you had this flowering of ideas, the new ideas replacing the old, and therefore, basically it was the dawn of a new age, and that is normally referred as the modern age. And Machiavelli was standing precisely at this point of time when this transition was taking place from medieval to the modern. Of course, the modern had not emerged in clear cut terms. Therefore, some of the features of the modern thought which crystallized much later, in fact, those things are not to be seen in Machiavelli, only you can see some broad indications, broad hints, broad ideas, along which line the Western political thinking evolved later. For example, one of the important marker of modern period is the rise and birth of modern nation state, and this is perhaps one of the important determinants of Machiavelli's political thought. The kind of disorder, the kind of chaos, the kind of anarchy, kind of disorderly administration and governance which he saw in Italy, and his quest for this consolidated, unified, powerful, strong nation state in Italy. In fact, this was his quest which led him to basically write a book like this Prince, which is perhaps his magnum opus, though of course, as I mentioned that he penned two books, Prince and the Discourse, but Prince still is considered to be his representative political writing or intellectual product. So, what he does in Prince, he basically in Prince tries to give certain advice, certain counsel to the ruler, that how he should conduct his administration, how he should rule, and it is here that we get the first glance of his political ideas, that how Machiavelli brings all his experiences, all his ideas, all his knowledge to basically the working of his political thought. Though it is also to be remembered that Machiavelli is not considered to be a very profound philosophical, his ideas are not considered to be quite profound philosophically. He is not considered to be a very systematic theoretical mind. He is not considered to be as profound as many other Western political thinkers, but nonetheless, the utility of Machiavelli's political thought is normally understood and seen in terms of the realism which he basically demonstrated, in terms of the application of some of his observations and experiences, and therefore many people believe that the kind of scientific method which he brought to bear on his study and analysis, so much so that one of the authorities on Machiavelli's political thought, Cassirer, in his famous book Myth of the State, calls him a scientist and compares Machiavelli with Galileo. The kind of science which Galileo laid the foundation of, he believes that Machiavelli also laid the foundation of science of politics. This is the opinion of Cassirer, but many people do not agree with Cassirer, because for them science is not just collection of facts, or science is not empiricism or observation, but science is basically leap of reason, not leap of facts. But Machiavelli was not maybe moving beyond these facts to explanation, to reason, and therefore his entire method cannot be called a scientific method. We will basically look at this methodological dimension of Machiavelli's political thought later. But what I am trying to tell you, that nonetheless the kind of breakthrough which he made, kind of new initiatives which he took, all these things basically have immortalized Machiavelli in the whole corpus of writings which are available to us as Western political thought. And it is in this context that we are discussing that how Machiavelli was basically reflecting on the changing time of his period, and that change, that transition is to be seen in terms of this Renaissance which was basically sweeping the Western world. Now, as we have seen that this Renaissance therefore was in terms of reawakening or basically remembering the past glories of Athens and Rome, the ancient Greek and ancient Roman history, Roman period. And this is also seen in Machiavelli to a great extent, of course with many modifications. For example, in fact in Greek political period, as we know, Greek political thinking, virtues are basically elevated to a position where in fact they are in a commanding position. Even the politics is seen through the prism of virtues. Justice is seen through the prism of virtue. So, virtuous and non-virtuous, this distinction was a very significant distinction in Greek period. But here what we find that and virtues, of course, one of the aspect of virtue is of course morality, ethics, good and bad, consideration of good and bad. Of course, whatever the definition of that good and bad was available at that time, that is a different question, but nonetheless this was important consideration. But in Machiavelli what we find that the first important thing he does, that he basically separate this ethics from politics, ends from the means, good from the bad, and believes that for politics these things are not important. What is important for politics is the result, the outcome, end, and therefore as it is commonly understood that he justified end not means, that is the end which justifies means, not means which justify end. And therefore a lot of people make comparison between the modern thinker of of Indian origin, Mahatma Gandhi, with Machiavelli, that how Gandhi wanted to sacrifice everything including the end for the means, the purity of means. But for Machiavelli it was not the purity of means which was to be given more importance, because it was ultimately end which justifies the means. But of course it is a simplistic understanding of the Machiavelli's political thought, it was not that simple, but he of course believed that the king has to ultimately justify his action with reference to the outcome, not with reference to the kind of path he travelled on or the kind of means he adopted, and therefore there is no court of law in politics except the outcome. So ultimately people judge their rulers not through the prism of the means or the virtues which he basically practiced, but only through the prism of outcome through which basically he arrived at a particular destination or attained a particular end. So this is what he wanted to do through this separation. So ethics and politics, and therefore there are 3-4 important issues in Machiavelli which are quite significant. This ethics and politics question, the question of statecraft, the question of his method, and finally this assessment of Machiavelli's political thought. Now we will basically take up all these issues one by one. But before that, as I was discussing, the impact of this Renaissance on his political thinking, and because Renaissance influenced not only his political thinking, but was influencing or determining the course of history in the West after 14th, 15th century, particularly 15th century and 16th century. And therefore, Italy was the epicenter, because what happened when the Constantinople fell, and what happened, that many scholars ran from there and went to Italy. They basically brought with them many ideas and many new thinking, and basically that became the link with the ancient past. And this is why Italy became the epicenter of this Renaissance political thinking. And Machiavelli was the child of, therefore, that epoch, or that basically movement, intellectual movement, the Renaissance movement. Now, of course, it was a humanist movement, but of course, it had a social context, a social background, and the situation was, as it is normally believed, was appropriate, or situation was conducive for the growth of new ideas at that time. And it is here the role of capitalism is also to be understood, because the rise of a new class, the merchant class, and this quest and the aspiration of this merchant class to get out of the old, that is the medieval shackles, that is basically this feudal, the alliance of the feudalism and the church and the papacy, which had basically throttled or strangulated any creative thinking in medieval period, had led to a new quest for new thinking. And it was this objective conditions, ripe objective conditions, the conducive objective conditions of that period, that the emerging middle class, the aspiration for the new changes, for market, for new creativity, all these things basically led to a situation where capitalism became basically the most conducive factor for the rise and growth of new ideas. Now, along with this, we should also remember the scientific revolution of that period, because the modern period, or the birth of the modern period, would remain basically incomplete without the discussion of the scientific revolution. For example, Copernicus 1473 to 1543, Galileo 1564 to 1642, Italian. Now, these scientists, along with many other, Kepler and others, what happened, that they heralded a new era when this entire scientific discourse was changing. Instead of earth becoming the center of universe, now it was becoming a different discourse in science. For this famous statement, Galileo, earth goes around the sun, basically led to his persecution, but nonetheless basically set a new trend, a new pattern in scientific thinking. So, scientific revolution, which was questioning the old orthodoxy, and that orthodoxy was basically trying to persecute these scientists, and therefore a new type of conflict was emerging. So, in arena of science you had conflict, in arena of religion we can see the conflict between the church and Pope on the one hand and the king on the other, and that is why after Machiavelli, the another important significant political thinker in the West is Hobbes, is Leviathan, that how 1649 the Puritan revolution, the kind of consolidation of the state which Hobbes was basically espousing through his book Leviathan, in order to weaken the hold of the church, and basically that was signaling a new development, that it is basically, for example, this entire theory of contract, the contract theory of a state, that how a state has emerged, where from a state has emerged, and the way this social contract theories like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau basically propounded this theory, that a state is not the creation of God, but a state is the creation of human beings through contract, and therefore basically put human beings on the seat of God. And basically that challenged not only authority of Pope, but basically that signaled a new change, that how human-centric, anthropocentric political thinking started at that time. But this happened after Machiavelli. Now, this entire conflict, the famous 30 Years' War, the religious war, and after this conclusion of 30 Years' War, the famous Treaty of Westphalia 1648, which is also considered important for the rise and growth and emergence of modern nation state, where the 4 important attributes of nation state were for the first time defined: territory, government, sovereignty and population. And that Westphalian nation state, which has survived till today, and it is basically gaining in importance, all these developments were coming in quick succession, one after another. And therefore, when we talk of modernity, we talk of modernity in this holistic frame, where you have all these things contributing in one way or the other. That is Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, capitalism, so on and so forth. So, what I am trying to basically discuss here, that this transition from feudalism to capitalism, because feudalism was characterized by this alliance between the church and the feudal lords, and the people who were at the bottom, the oppressed sections, did not have any place in this scheme of things. So, this transition therefore was quite significant, and it is in this context of transition that we find that this new reawakening or new basically this awakening is taking place, where people suddenly are starting the past glory of Rome and past glory of Athens. Of course, for Machiavelli it was more Rome than Athens. The Roman glorious Roman past, he was more nostalgic about it. That is why this entire antiquity in his political thought, the way he glorified antiquity. That is why the way he made use of history. Of course, we will discuss that history in his method of course had a selective value, because the way he looked at history is not the proper way to understand history, because for him history repeats itself, and history does not simply repeat, but also history sometimes goes beyond this repetition. And that is why we have another thinker in the West, Karl Marx, who much later believed that history, for him history was also equally important, but in his hands history had a different meaning than what normally we see in Machiavelli. So, what happens therefore, that with Machiavelli you have this new intellectual climate, intellectual tradition emerging. The way in literature we have had Shakespeare, in science, as I have mentioned, many scientists of that period who were questioning, challenging the existing paradigm. So, Machiavelli is also now trying to question and challenge the old paradigm of political thinking. Now, of course, the context, as I was mentioning, the way this powerful state, consolidation of a state was the feature of the political life in the West at that time, which later on became more consolidated and pronounced as Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. But even at that time, the quest for a powerful consolidated nation state in Italy on the part of Machiavelli was a significant determinant so far as Machiavelli's political thinking is considered. So, therefore, he is concerned. So, for this patriotism, at times Machiavelli's political thought is also understood as a patriotic political thought. Basically, it was influenced highly by the Italy's political conditions, and therefore, the application and validity were confined to Italy, not beyond that, because it was largely governed by the conditions obtaining in Italy, not beyond that. But this is not true, because some of the arguments which Machiavelli offers about politics, about the art of administration, about the mechanics of government, those arguments are not simply to be seen in terms of the political challenges which Italy was facing at that time. Those challenges can also be seen in the context of the other parts of the world, and that is why many people at times make a comparison between Machiavelli's political thought and Kautilya's political thought, an Indian political thinker Kautilya, which is also known as Chanakya, particularly his book Arthashastra. Though it is called Arthashastra, but it is a book more on administration and government than on economics. And what Kautilya does in his Arthashastra is basically something of similar vein. He also is trying to give suggestions, he is also trying to offer number of advices that how the ruler should rule, how the ruler should conduct the administration. And the kind of realism which one finds in Machiavelli, similar realism one also finds in Kautilya. As basically we can see that if Machiavelli's political thought was conditioned by the challenges which the state was facing in Italy, Cortely's political thinking was governed and basically conditioned by the challenges which the Mauryan state of his time was facing. So, there is a commonality, the similarity in the context, as it happens in most of the thinkers, and this is what I mentioned, the sociology of knowledge is quite important. Now, what happened, that the techniques of government therefore are important for Machiavelli, that how the techniques have to be correct. If the techniques are not correct, then the governance cannot deliver, the government cannot deliver, and how the king should make use of good techniques, the right techniques, and basically what method he should adopt while making use of those techniques. So, these are the concerns of basically Machiavelli. Now, one thing, as I have mentioned, that it was a turbulent period. Now, what happened? The republican form of government, the 4 years of turbulent republican experiment had a very painful experience Machiavelli had, and therefore, what happened, that on basis of those experiences, what Machiavelli did, that in 1517 he authored this book called Prince, and basically a kind of advice to the Prince Medica, and in 1517 he authored another book, that is Discourse, and lot of people believe that the argument, the tone and tenor of the two books are different, but then there are also scholars like Sabine, and he believes that it is not true. There is no inconsistency in Machiavelli's argument, and the two books should be seen through the same lens, and that was the decline of the state, and his entire quest is to basically revamp or re-strengthen or to make the state more effective and powerful. Of course, the entry point is different, but nonetheless there is no major inconsistency in his political ideas as they are available to us through these two writings, Prince and Discourse. This is the opinion of Sabine. But of course, there are many other scholars who would not agree with Sabine, and they believe that basically the entire argument in Prince is different from the argument in Discourse. Okay. Now, what happens, that many people argue that treatment of government in Prince is different from the treatment of government in the Discourse. Many people believe that in Prince he prioritizes and privileges monarchical form of government, whereas in Discourse he is basically going for a republican form of government. In fact, if someone of Rousseau's stature, a thinker like Rousseau, he also believes that Machiavelli offers two conflicting views on government, and therefore he is basically, but nonetheless it is to be remembered that even today it is the Prince which is considered to be his representative writing, but nonetheless Discourse is equally significant, because in Discourse some of the things which he talks of, including this republican form of government, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that for Machiavelli, if people are virtuous, the ideal form of his republic; if people are vicious, then the ideal form is monarchy. But he always, and from the very beginning until the end, he did not think very high of aristocracy, that is nobility, because he believed that nobility is basically rule of the few, and that is always in self interest in a manner which is detrimental to the middle class as well as the ordinary people. So, therefore, he did not think of aristocracy as a good form of government, but of course, he was vacillating between monarchy and the republic, and he believed that if the virtuous people are there, then of course this republic is a better form of government, but if the people are not virtuous, there are vices among them, if they are vicious, if they are they are selfish, then of course the monarchy is the only way out. So, if the people are not public spirited, and therefore the public spirit becomes very important, because public spirit, lack of public spirit is the cause of corruption, and if there is a corruption, then of course the only way to govern that society is to have monarchy. So, in Machiavelli's political thought, therefore the public spirit is quite important, that how to have a society full of public spirit, and therefore when you have that public spirited people, then of course republican form of government can also be thought of. Now, keeping in mind that this type of dilemma which he was facing, and one can say it was not a dilemma, because as a realist, as an empiricist, he basically based his entire writings on his own observations, and he generalized his own observations in a manner as if that was going to be a truth for all the time to come. And therefore, many people question his entire method, that can we call it a scientific method, because science is not simply generalization of observation, but it is more than that. And that is why I mentioned that science is leap of reason. Now, in fact, there are a number of things. A lot of people argue that he talked of human nature, but he talked of human nature in such a way that human nature is unchanging, because his notion of history is also unchanging, because history is an important method for him, I mean it is an important source for his political thinking, and that is why this antiquity plays very important role. Now, from history, from the historical experience, from his own experience, from his own observation, he basically arrives at conclusion. So, what happens? History is unchanging. He believes that what happened in the past can get repeated in the present and maybe repeating in the future. So, whatever experience we have gained out of the past, that experience can be generalized for present and the future. And this is here that a lot of people subject him to rigorous scrutiny. That history is important, everything emerges in history, science emerges in history, superstition emerges in history, origin of an idea in history is one thing and its utility and validity another thing. So, he believed that whatever has emerged in history is good, and therefore, the past history can be good guide for the future. But of course, that means history in his hands is a repetitive thing, it gets repeated from time to time, and therefore, it becomes a source for the future. But and therefore, when he declared with lot of fanfare that I am going to tread a path that no one has ever treaded. So, in fact, his entire thing was that he is going to discuss things based on historical experience which others had not done. Of course, others had done earlier, but perhaps not in his time or not in the medieval period. So, this is what his new road was. Now, what happened that his history therefore is full of problems, the imitative history. Now, for example, the repetitive history. Apart from this history, the human nature, because as history is unchanging in his hand, so is the human nature. He believes that nature of human beings never changes, unchanging nature of man, and therefore, this famous statement which is attributed to him, that man can forget the murder of his or assassination of his father, but he cannot forget the confiscation of his property. This is the nature of man, the selfish, and in fact, this brutish nature of man. This nature is unchanging, and therefore, he based his entire understanding of politics on this nature of man, that if man's nature is so unchanging, then basically on basis of this observation, on basis of this generalization, a kind of art of administration and government can emerge, and the prince, that is the ruler in a monarchy, or for that matter a ruler in any form of government, can base his entire technique of administration, the mechanics of governance on basis of this nature of man. But of course, as we have seen that man's nature has been analyzed by number of Western thinkers, and this has been argued that man's nature is also changing like any other phenomenon, natural and social phenomenon, because reality is ever changing. This is what those thinkers who believed in dialectics, including Hegel and Marx, would argue, that reality is ever changing. The famous Greek dictum that we cannot step twice into the same river, because by the time we will enter in the river, we will not have the same water beneath our feet, the water would have passed off. So, therefore, this changing nature of reality also applies to human beings, that human beings are also not static, they are also changing, every moment they are changing. Therefore, it is often said that we are living and dying at the same time, living because we are living and dying because every time we breathe, we are basically going closer to our death. So, that is basically the nature of man, changing. The life is changing, reality is changing, everything is changing. But in Machiavelli's perception, human nature is static, and therefore, in fact, this someone like Karl Marx, who came much later, believed that how human nature is also conditioned by the social situation. Man's nature is not independent and autonomous from social situation. It is the society, the social conditions, the economic conditions, those conditions which determine human nature. In fact, in hands of Karl Marx, human nature has two different dimensions: human nature in general and as it is modified in each historical epoch. As he believed that human nature in general is one, which is basically nature, inherent nature, innate nature. But that nature is not fixed, it keeps changing. And therefore, his argument was that when this quest for the new order was there, for example, if socialism and communism they emerge in the in the Marxian scheme of things, then this original, the general nature of man would basically get revived. That is the pre-conscious activity. This is what he discusses in his famous book Economic and Philosophic Manuscript. So therefore, the human nature gets modified in each historical epoch according to the situation. In feudal period, human nature is different. In capitalism, the human nature has to be different. So it basically keeps changing. But in Machiavelli, human nature is also static. It doesn't change, and therefore he bases his entire argument on this perception of human nature, this perception of history. Now, of course, with this background, with the kind of legacy which he was carrying, the Renaissance political thinking, in fact, we find that number of new initiatives he is basically taking in terms of his political method in political thinking. One of the important initiative, as I told you, was of course the secularization, because secularism, as it is known, that after this fight between the church and the state and later on the rise of democracy, the entire Western society underwent a process which is normally referred as secularization, where religion became the matter of private life, not the public life. The distinction between private and public came into existence, and religion was relegated to the background. The kind of primacy which was accorded to religion was no longer there, and this process is called secularization. And this also had happened in modern times along with this Renaissance, Reformation and scientific revolution. In Machiavelli, before all these things could be completed, because some of the thinkers who followed Machiavelli could see these process and their completion, but Machiavelli had not seen all these things, but he was imagining that situation, and that is perhaps a strength, and that is the beauty of his political thought, because he is writing in a period when most of the things had not stabilized, had not settled. Even the modern nation state, even the capitalism was its infancy, even the scientific revolution had only started then. So in fact, what happens therefore, that Machiavelli was ahead of his time when he is talking about a kind of political order in which he doesn't give much importance to religion, to church, to pope, to papacy, and therefore this metaphysical thinking is not there. The theocratic thinking is not there, which was the hallmark of the medieval period. The theocratic, the overall or the immense importance or supremacy of religion and the interpreters and custodian of religion and the scriptures. So what happens therefore, that in terms of his method, we find lot of new things. Of course, apart from this secularization of politics, in fact, we also find a new emphasis in Machiavelli on facts, and therefore many people get confused. They believe that Machiavelli was a scientific thinker, but that is not true, because science, as I was mentioning, is not only about facts, but science includes many other things including facts. So kind of empiricism which he brings to his political interpretation, his political explanation, many people believe that that was science. But what we find in name of science in Machiavelli is only observations based on facts from history. He is making use of history, and he is generalizing on basis of those observations. He is basically offering number of facts, and therefore he believes that he is going to tread a path which no one has ever treaded, that is the path of these facts, the path and path of this history. Now, another important thing is this value judgment, because one of the cornerstone of this scientific discourse in modern time is basically this gulf between facts and value, or kind of separation between facts and values, because he believed that science, if there is facts, emphasis on facts, then you are basically with science, and if you are emphasizing values, then you are with basically not science. So, the facts values distinction lot of people associate with science, and therefore, many people feel that Machiavelli kind of the kind of the emphasis which he laid on facts and did not give much importance to values. Therefore, in fact, Machiavelli can be called a scientific thinker, but that is not true, because of course, he is against ethical principles of politics. He believes that politics has its own ethics, politics has its own rules, politics has its own morality, and therefore, the rules of ethics and morality from other domain cannot be applied to politics. And therefore, when he gives number of suggestions to the ruler that how he or she can rule, he basically tries to keep values out of the purview of politics, and therefore, many people believe that because he separated values from facts, ethics from politics, therefore, in fact, his ideas were scientific. But as I have mentioned, that lot of scholars also question it, that this is not the way a scientific method should be seen. Number one, even his entire use of history is not perfect, entire use of history is also rather questionable, his entire use of facts or empirical method is also questionable, because this is not how a scientific method is to be used. Similarly, another important limitation of his political thought, so far as his scientific method is concerned, is that there is no skepticism in Machiavelli. There is no occurrence of doubts on any issue. The way he handles things as if they are final, there is no questioning, and therefore, a lot of people believe that skepticism, absence of skepticism perhaps proves that Machiavelli's political thinking cannot be called a scientific political thinking. Even in terms of observations, observations have to be coordinated, observations have to be basically analyzed, observations have to be explained, but no such explanation, no such coordination you can see in Machiavelli, and therefore, a lot of people feel that his entire method, scientific method, is not basically a scientific method, so as to say. Even the understanding of power, the way he is basically looking at power, in fact, the way he is giving advice to the ruler. In fact, there is one scholar who believes that what we see in Machiavelli is not a sociology of power, rather a zoological feature of the struggle of power in a slave society, a society in which the minority rules over a toiling majority. That is perhaps best coming out in the writings of Machiavelli. It is not a proper understanding of the sociology of power, and therefore, in fact, the kind of sociology of power, the dynamics of power, that how power emerges, what are the sources of power, what are the social and economic linkages of power, how one becomes powerful, how the power is used. In fact, the kind of argument we find in many other traditions of Western political thinking, including Marx, when he looked at the power of the state as the power of the ruling class and associated the power of the ruling class with his dominance on the economic structure of society, and therefore, he offered a sociological and political economy argument of power. Now, that type of argument we do not find in Machiavelli. Here we simply find a zoological feature of the struggle of power in the way it operates in society, and one of the thinker has basically called it, perhaps Leo Strauss has called it a zoological feature of the struggle of power in slave society, in which minority rules over the toiling majority. But nonetheless, one thing is important, that the social context of power is absent. For example, that interested him very little, that how the social determinants also matter in politics, how the social determinants also matter for the ruler and the ruled both. The kind of dual morality he talked of, the morality of the rulers and morality for the ruled. Now, that tells you that he made a distinction, and therefore, he was not interested in the sociology of power, and lot of people believe that he was more of a publicist, writing on the contemporary issues, and basically past events recorded in history, and those recorded events being generalized by him, and on basis of those generalization he is coming to those some conclusions and offering advices to the ruler. So, therefore, it is not a deep philosophical inquiry as it is normally seen in other political thinkers of the subsequent generation, but nonetheless, as Hegel has rightly pointed out, that Machiavelli established truly the necessary and basic principles for the formation of a state, that how a state is formed, how a state is consolidated, and how the consolidation of a state is important for social and political well-being or stability of the people. For example, the kind of problem which Hegel was facing in Germany, and therefore, in Hegel's political thought with different method, with different orientation, with different type of approach, he also had a similar problem, that is basically looking at the state as the source through which basically emancipation and freedom could be delivered. And therefore, when he makes this observation that Machiavelli established truly necessary basic principles for the formation of a state, and particularly the conditions which obtained in that period, in fact, Hegel is basically trying to justify also his own political thought, because Hegel was also perhaps struggling with the same situation which Machiavelli struggled in his time in Italy. So, therefore, there are a number of limitations with his history as a approach, with science as a method, with facts as a tool to generalize, or observation as a mechanism to arrive at any conclusive decision. So, therefore, there are a number of limitations in his method, but one thing is very important. The two observations which I made at the very beginning, the separation of ethics and politics, and his entire statecraft, which tried to basically demonstrate his realism, and that is why, as I mentioned, that he is compared that with Kautilya's ancient Indian political thinker, because he also wanted to consolidate the Mauryan state at that time, and Machiavelli also is trying to consolidate this nation state in Italy, and the kind of disarray is found itself. And at that time, when other states were getting consolidated, it is not just a chance that Italy perhaps later on became the most late comer so far as this modernity and other things are concerned in terms of the development of capitalism, so on and so forth. So, this problem was basically Italy specific, and therefore, Machiavelli emerges as a kind of a messenger, or a kind of he offers an argument simply to reflect on the situation which was prevailing then. But some of the arguments which are available in his writings were ahead of his time, and therefore, many people believe that many things which took place much later in political theory and political thought in the West could be seen in him. For example, the entire notion of sovereignty of course emerged for the first time in Boda, later on Hobbes and many other Western political thinkers, but the way he wanted to make a state powerful, make a state consolidated, wanted to consolidate the hold of the state on the society, that was quite significant. So was the case with secularism, so was the case with banishing religion from politics, so was the case in making king a more realist in terms of his approach towards governance and administration. For example, the argument which he offered that how kings should combine the qualities of lion and the fox both, because a king should combine these things. So, what are the qualities of a ruler? That was his perhaps main objective in his writings, and how those qualities can enable the ruler to offer the best possible rule. Of course, even in terms of rule, as I mentioned, that he was basically vacillating between monarchy and the republic, and that was largely on account of this virtues, that if people are virtuous, of course, he believed republic would be better. Of course, even the virtues and ethics, many people feel that on the one hand he was product of Renaissance, on the other hand the virtue was such a important quality and feature of Greek political thinking, but he wanted to banish it, particularly virtue in terms of ethics. So, this is what lot of people talk about Machiavelli, even on ethics and politics, as I was talking ends and means, and many people say the end justifies means this is what Machiavelli's political thought is all about, but it is not that simplistic. Of course, he believed that if the only court of law in politics is the outcome, if outcome is good, if outcome is satisfactory, if outcome is basically in the interest of people, everything is forgiven. If the outcome is not in the interest of people, then even if you have pursued a virtuous path or a pious path or ethical means, then that will not be condoned if outcome is not in the interest of the people. So, it is outcome which justifies. So, this kind of realism which he wanted to demonstrate, and therefore, I mentioned in the very beginning that lot of people pit Machiavelli with our modern thinker Gandhi, that for Gandhi everything was to be sacrificed for good means, because if means are pious, then end is bound to be good, end is bound to be pious. If your means are not pure, then whatever you achieve, that end will remain transient and temporary, it will not have a longer lifespan. So, therefore, you have number of contending positions, number of contending arguments so far as ethics and politics are concerned, but Machiavelli of course stands on one pole so far as this ethics and politics is concerned, and as we have discussed that it was in context of the challenges which his period, his society and his people were facing, and therefore, he wanted to make a generalized observation on politics, ethics, statecraft, so on and so forth. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, sir, for this lecture. Dear friends, if you have any question regarding this lecture, please write us back on our official email ID, which will be showing just after this lecture. And for your information, we will be having lecture on political thoughts of Locke in our next lecture with Dr. Jha. So keep tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much, sir, for being here.